So then we've seen how to use promises now to manage our network requests and our functions that fire when the requests are complete, either resolved or rejected. Now, one of the best things about promises is that we can chain them together, so we can perform one asynchronous task after another in order should we need to. Now, we've seen how to do that using callbacks, which results in messy, deeply nested code. Chaining promises gives us a much cleaner and easier way to do it. So what I'm doing here is, first of all, calling getToDos once we're getting these to-dos. Then when we call the resolve function up here, it's firing this function in the then method. And if we get an error, it fires this function in the catch method. So remember, we want to get this data sequentially. So we know down here when we fire this function in the then method that we've already got the first lot of data. And this would be a safe position now if we wanted to do this sequentially to go out and try and get the next lot of data. So what I could do here is say getToDos again. And then this time we want Mario. So we'll say todos / Mario.json. And this returns a promise. Now we could tack on the .then method there and fire a function in here that takes the data, but that kind of defeats the whole point of promise chaining. Instead, what I'm going to do, because this thing here returns a promise, what I'm going to do is say in front of that, return. And what that means is that the parent of this thing right here, the whole thing now has a return value of a promise, this thing. So since this returns a promise, now I can tack on the .then method again at the end. So I can say .then and pass a function in here, and this function will fire when this one is complete. So we can pass through the data in here and delete those parentheses. And then in here we can say console.log, and I'll say promise 2 resolved and output the data. And up here, I'll say promise 1 resolved. So what we're doing is going out, we're getting the first lot of to-dos, and we're getting this callback function, which runs when we have those. We're logging them to the console, then we're returning this request right here, which returns a promise to the whole thing, because we're calling return right here. So now this whole thing returns the promise that we get back from this. And since this all returns that promise, we can just tack on .then to this. And so this function is going to fire when this request is done and we have data. Now, if we get an error in the second request, the good thing about the catch at the end is that it catches any error. So we don't have to rewrite this for every .then. We just have one catch at the end and one function that runs for any error. So that's nice. So now we have this second lot of data, and if I save it now, we can see over here that we actually get an error, and it says error getting resource. So let's see what's gone wrong, and that's because we still have S on the end of Luigi. If I save it now and refresh, now we can see we have promise 1 resolved, then promise 2, and they both have the correct data. So then let's do this again. We want to get the next lot of data once we have this data, so we can say again, return getToDos, and this time pass in todos / Sean.json. And then, since we're returning that, this whole thing is now returning that promise. So we can tack on another .then method right here. And inside, we do another callback function that takes the data from that request. And then we can log it to the console, console.log. And we'll say promise 3 resolved and pass in the data. So let's give this a whirl. I'm going to save it and refresh, and now we can see 1, 2, and 3, and we have all of that data. So this is still working all in order. And notice now we don't have that big triangle eaten into our code. We don't get callback hell, and this looks a lot more logical one after another. So that's one of the really nice things about promises, the way we can chain them together like this. Now I want to show you if we have an error anywhere. So this is the third time we try to get data. I'm going to make this an error by putting an S on the end. This is still going to fire for that error. So let me save it, and we can see over here we get resolve for 1, resolve for 2, then we get promise rejected, error getting the resource. So this works for any of these things right here. Any request, if we have a .catch method on the end and we have a function which takes that error. It's going to fire for any error in any one of these requests, which is really, really nice. So my friends, that is how we chain promises together.